How's it going, everyone? It's Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and let's talk about Dungeons of Hinterberg, a new action-adventure title from developer Microbird Games. This one honestly took me by surprise. Now, I'll admit that I didn't have any expectations going in. I just saw that it was recently added to Game Pass, and because it's an action-adventure title, I wanted to give it a try. But I'm really glad I took the time out to check out this title because it's been pretty great so far. You play as Louisa, a junior lawyer who finds herself on a much-needed vacation in the tourist hotspot of Hinterberg, located in the Austrian Alps. Now, what makes this town so special is that it is the only place where magic exists. I think this by itself would make Hinterberg the vacation destination, but when you add dungeons with loot and monsters, it is practically a guarantee that Hinterberg will be in business for the foreseeable future, even if the risks are high. And if you doubt that, just think of the Jurassic Park films, because the moment we threw dinosaurs in there, people are willing to risk their lives just to go see them. So if magic was real, you can expect the same result. The game opens with Louisa arriving at Hinterberg. She checks into her hotel but finds out that her room isn't ready. Teresa, who's the owner of the hotel, tells her that she can go and meet Klaus, the town's tour guide, and this is where things kick off as Louisa enters her first dungeon. Things immediately go awry as Klaus and Louisa are separated, and even though Louisa thinks nothing of it at first, this changes the moment Klaus shows up. She notices that he is very concerned because the situation they find themselves in is not normal. Louisa ends up traversing most of the dungeon alone, and when she reaches the end, she ends up fighting the dungeon boss, and upon defeating it, must make a hasty escape. To leave dungeons in this game, you must utilize a stamp book. It is the only way to open the exit gate, and with the help of Klaus, Louisa barely escapes and is brought back to the hotel where her journey as a slayer begins. The next few days see you getting acclimated to the world and its mechanics. There are a number of tutorials you're introduced to, which probably the most important in my opinion being the social relationships aspect. The catch to Dungeons of Hinterberg is that during the day, you are a slayer. You are exploring different biomes, looking for dungeons, defeating monsters, completing said dungeons, and then heading back to Hinterberg once that's complete. In the evening, you are free to explore the town, buy supplies and gear, but more importantly, you're going to meet new people and develop relationships that will assist you during the game. Every morning, Louisa will generally reflect on the day prior, and sometimes you'll encounter residents or other slayers. Conversations with these individuals will provide greater context into the mystery of the dungeons or into Hinterberg itself, and you'll also learn their individual motivations for being there. Some of these are fairly simple. They just want to kill monsters and become famous. I don't blame them. Others are like Louisa, who are desperately trying to find themselves, and they believe that by traversing the various dungeons, they'll be able to do so. Sometimes you'll get invited to special events in the evening, and this will help progress the narrative. You'll learn very quickly that not everything is as it seems, and that the narrative found here, coupled with the strong character interactions, can be very compelling as the game progresses. It definitely took me by surprise because I expected a fairly cozy game, but what I got was the complete opposite, and I appreciate the developers for having a thoughtful discussion about the consequences of magic existing in a world that was originally devoid of it. After you get past the scripted morning events, you're going to choose a biome to explore. At first, you are limited to one biome, with the reasoning being that the earthquake has caused a lot of trouble, and that's okay because I believe the first biome does a good job of teaching the player the basics of exploration, how dungeon levels work, and the use of magic in both combat and exploration. Now, before you do any real exploring in a biome, you're going to head to a skill shrine and learn the magic that is specific to that area. The magic you learn will help you complete environmental puzzles and will assist you in combat. It's not something that can be spammed in combat, as you do have a mana meter, but once you're out of combat, feel free to use the magic any way you want to. There are blobs of goo that litter the environment that you can destroy to recover health and mana in case you run low. You can, of course, buy potions, but they are expensive early on, so make sure to destroy any blob you run into to ensure that you're prepped in case enemies appear. In combat, you'll utilize your sword. I don't think there are any other weapons to switch to, at least I'm at level 7 right now and haven't seen anything. And Combat can feel really basic early on. You have a light and heavy attack, with the latter being able to knock down enemies if you chain heavy attacks together, but as you progress, you'll be introduced to attack conduits, and these are skills that you can utilize in combat, and their cooldown is dependent on you attacking enemies. These can be devastating when used in conjunction with your magic, and as most encounters will usually deal with multiple enemies at the same time, it is recommended that you utilize all tools at your disposal to make encounters easier. Defensively, you only have the option to dodge, but this is something you cannot spam as you have a stamina meter. You shouldn't be in too much danger early on though, as enemies do telegraph their attacks. Later encounters do feature large groups of enemies with different skill sets, and this is where things can get tricky. I was generally focusing on the ranged enemies at first because they can be relentless with some of their AoE attacks, but if you ignore the elite enemies who will chase you non-stop, they will absolutely one-shot you at times if your gear is not properly leveled. I do feel though that when you reach this point in the game, I think combat becomes pretty fun, as you should have some really cool attack conduits to assist you in battle. When you aren't in combat, you're going to be exploring and solving puzzles. Each dungeon features unique puzzles, and while they are simple early on and will probably take you less than 10 minutes to complete, once you hit around level 3, they will become multi-tiered areas with some really fun puzzles to complete. I think I have 10 or so dungeons left, and in my opinion, I think that the dungeons in this game scale well with their environmental puzzles. My expectation was that the first biome would have beginner level dungeons only, but thankfully that isn't the case. Each biome features multiple dungeons with varying difficulty, and I believe this was intended to keep the experience fresh for the player. I really like this decision because it allows you to experience the different biomes, you get to experiment with their different magic, and even though you'll notice that some of the early dungeons of each biome feature simple puzzles, that's primarily to get you acclimated. Once the dungeons start to progress in overall difficulty, the puzzles will scale in complexity, and I think for the most part, they are all really enjoyable. Now, there is one dungeon that I experienced that was just okay, and I think for the most part, it was primarily due to the fact that I felt like the mechanics just didn't fit. It just felt a little janky at times, but most dungeons in this game range from really good to great. And for those wondering what's waiting for you at the end of each dungeon, it's normally an elite enemy and a bunch of mobs for you to fight. Sometimes you won't have an enemy encounter at all because the entire level is one big puzzle. And that was fine for me because I think those are the most fun to explore. That's the end of my rant. And as I was writing this script and thinking about the criticisms of this game, the only thing that really jumped to my head was the fact that that second boss was a letdown. The other thing for me is probably the movement speed, and it's not what I would describe as quick, and you can probably see it on the screen right now, but the thing is, you have one biome that allows you to snowboard, and for whatever reason, this is your magical ability, and I think this is pretty cool. It's a lot quicker than you just moving on foot, and it surprisingly handles well. Outside of that, though, you are walking, and while I was hoping that there would be something of an increase to my overall speed as the game progressed, I haven't found it yet. I was looking to see if there were any relationships that would make me quicker, but that search led nowhere. Luckily, this game features a fast travel system, and as you enter into a major area, you're going to encounter information boards. These act as fast travel points. I appreciate that the developers put these in convenient areas such as outside of dungeons or shops because it makes getting to these areas a breeze. And while the areas do feature some changes as the game goes along, you'll want to still fast travel because it is very convenient. Also, make sure you explore thoroughly because you will be rewarded with loot and gear. You're going to notice that you're going to get a lot of trash early on, but if you check in with Claws, you can sell that trash for the in-game currency. There are also other ways to make money, and the game will provide helpful hints as you progress. It was a struggle early on, I'll admit that, but once you hit around the level 3 dungeons, you're going to make money pretty quickly. So before we end the video, I want to talk about the social aspect of this game. I want to really kind of highlight the importance of the relationships and why it really does benefit you. And then we'll talk about difficulty. So once you've completed a dungeon or have found a spot to relax at in a biome, you're going to be brought back to Hinterberg. And this is something I talked about earlier in the video. In the evening, if there is nothing planned, you're going to meet with other slayers or residents to hang out with, and you're going to develop relationships with these people. I mentioned before that doing so will also assist you in the dungeons, and that's because everyone you meet is going to provide some type of boost for the player. And these can include the ability to use weapon or armor charms, breakfast foods to boost stats before exploration, adding additional charm slots, these are pretty much accessories, attack conduits, and so on. There are so many benefits for the player that pretty much if you don't do any of this stuff, you are making the game harder on yourself. Hanging out with different individuals will also boost your various social statuses, and you're going to want to do that because you're going to find certain gear that will grant you a significant boost if you meet their social status prerequisite. This is one of the coolest things about the game, is that you'll constantly find gear and it's like you need to be renowned 150 to utilize it because it essentially doubles in its effects. And I think that's really cool. It's something I really like. Also, just talking to these people is going to grant you different quests that will have you meet other slayers, and it just kind of fills out your different books. It's very important that you really go out and meet people in the evening. Otherwise, you are literally hindering yourself in the game. And as you progress toward the later dungeons, the game does get more difficult. And if you don't have additional charm slots opened up, or if you don't have the armor slots opened up, you're going to find yourself struggling in some of these fights because you're going to be taking a lot of damage. And this is going to also lead into the levels of difficulty for the dungeons themselves. So basically, the only way you kind of level up in this game is by gear. So you have these different gear scores allocated, and basically you'll see that your offensive and defensive are like 1 as you start out, but as you progress and get new weapons, get new charm slots, you got all these different additions to the game, your gear score is going to increase. And basically, you want to be at or just below that overall dungeon difficulty, that level. Otherwise, you're more than likely going to struggle with those fights. Enemies are far more spongy when you start to like go into these areas in which you are under leveled, and you'll notice that you will take far more damage. So it's very important that you recognize that as you play this game, you want to be properly leveled and geared when you're going through. Now you can buy gear, that's completely fine, but when you talk to all these different people, they will also give you certain things, like for example, talking to Thea will grant you a key that will unlock all these different chests. Talking to Klaus for like the second time, right? Developing his social relationship will allow you to remove goo from different equipment, therefore you can equip it. It's one of those things where you really have to pay attention to what you're doing and who you're talking to because time is limited. But as long as you really take the time out to get to meet people, learn what they do, all their different benefits, they really do help you. And I think that's one of the best things about Dungeons of Hinterberg, is because you have combat, exploration, and then the social aspect, and everything affects one another. And I think that's fantastic. If you haven't noticed, I'm really enjoying my time with Dungeons of Hinterberg. I have spoke glowingly about this game, and for me, it's just, there's all this content here, and the game does a really good job of scaling in terms of difficulty and complexity as you progress. I think the narrative is strong, I think the character interactions are fun, and outside of the issues I had with the second boss, and a dungeon just being okay, and some of the movement stuff, this is a fairly polished experience. I think I ran into maybe 1 or 2 issues when using magic to platform was a bit janky, but beyond that, there was nothing frustrating, which was really surprising and really appreciated. If the final levels of this game are as strong as what I've played so far, I am really excited to see how this ends. Dungeons of Hinterberg can be found on Game Pass, and I highly recommend you give it a shot, because that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I will talk to you next time.